Ir pradėkime mūsų konferenciją. Norėčiau pakviesti čia ant scenos vieną žymiausių pasaulio karo analitikų, Jamestown Foundation prezidentą, poną Gleną Howardą. Please welcome Mr. Glen Howard on the stage.
Well, good morning, everyone. I'm very happy to be here. Those of you who don't know a little bit about Jamestown, I hope you can visit our website and learn a little bit about us, because we're not quite Russia today, but we are a very small organization and in Washington, and we have a very extensive reach to many parts of the United States, Europe, and also the rest of Eurasia. The title of my presentation today is The Rise of Hybrid Warfare and Its Threat to the Baltic States. First of all, I'd very much like to thank the opportunity and thank Ambassador Zygimantas Pavilonis for the opportunity to come to Lithuania to speak to you here at the Lithuanian Riflemen's Association. Many of you have heard the term hybrid warfare. The term has become widely used since the Russian intervention and invasion and annexation of Crimea, and also the invasion of eastern Ukraine in 2014. It's primarily been introduced by someone you may have heard about. The term has become introduced by a guy named Ukrainian politician and former director of the Ukrainian National Security and Defense Council, Andrei Parubiy. Thanks to Andrei Parubiy and his August 6, 2014 article in Ukrainska Pravda, we were able to learn a bit about what is the Russian theory of hybrid warfare. Hybrid warfare begins with a man by the name of Yevgeny Messner and his classic book called Insurgency, or the Name of the Third World War. Messner is a former colonel in the Tsarist General Staff of the Imperial Army. He served in the Russian White Guard, and he also served in the German Wehrmacht in the Second World War. And in his books, he explored the ideas in the 1960s and 1970s as an immigrant living in all places Argentina, where he wrote his classic work in the Name of the Third World War. This book has been very much embraced by the Russian military. The basis of this book and his theory of hybrid warfare is that future wars would be won through subversion and organized revolutions carried out by special forces and terrorists. A major tool and practitioner of hybrid warfare was the Russian mercenary GRU officer Igor Girkin, who became a legendary fighter in eastern Ukraine in the Donbass, fighting against the Ukrainians. Now, for me, myself, as someone who's watched the term of hybrid warfare evolve in its use in the Western discussions about the Russian military, I can say that hybrid warfare, in many ways, is not a new term. It is an incarnation of the term we use in Western military doctrine called nonlinear warfare, or commonly known as irregular warfare. Now, hybrid warfare began with the introductions of concepts of warfare, and it's really not unique in Eurasia. In fact, the concept of hybrid warfare emerged, as many of the military doctrines did in the Second World War. The concept of blitzkrieg was implemented against Poland in 1939. So often new theories for warfare begin in this part of the world, in Eurasia. And so this is the case when it happened with the Donbass. Now, what we've seen in eastern Ukraine has also been a point of also new introduction of military tactics and strategy. And this began in the 1920s in eastern Ukraine by Ukrainian anarchist by the name of Nestor Makhno, who introduced something that many of you are familiar with in the famous movies from the Soviet era of Chapayev, the use of the Taganka, which was the machine gun coating carriage that was used in the Russian Civil War against the White Guard units, and also later the Bolsheviks it was used. But the Taganka was it was a new age for warfare. And so, just as in hybrid warfare, they begin with the use of technology and tactics, have ability to change the nature of warfare. And that is what we've seen so much and been placed by the Russian military inside of Donbass and what they use, and also in Crimea. Now, with this, the name of Yevgeny Messner is very important because he's known as the father of hybrid warfare. So, as many of you know, the threats that Ukraine faces today will one day be the same threats that Lithuania may face, but in different conditions that are modified for the peculiar military strategic environment of the Baltic states. So in light of this development in the past couple of years, we need to realize that the theory of warfare is never stagnant. It's always changing. The attacks on 9/11 in the United States were a great tragedy, but many of the United States as NATO allies began a change in the concept of their tactics after 9/11. The United States became very focused on what they call counterinsurgency warfare. And so, unfortunately, many of the concepts of American the counterinsurgency warfare were carried out in Afghanistan. And in Afghanistan, we saw many of our Lithuanian and Baltic allies serving in Afghanistan, and they also were adopted counterinsurgency warfare techniques and strategies. But unfortunately, this affected many of their thinking in terms of homeland defense. Now, among all the Baltic states, there was one country that did not embrace counterinsurgency doctrine. And that country, that small country, is represented here today by our friend from the Home Guard, but it was Estonia. Estonia refused to endorse this concept and continued to remain focused on homeland defense. Now, the idea of homeland defense and the Riflemen's Association began with the Napoleonic idea of la vie en masse, or to quote Mao Zedong, the army swims in the sea of the people. To Estonia's great credit, they've continued to keep conscription going. They've never abandoned it. And unfortunately, as many countries here as Latvia moved away from conscription, and Lithuania, it had a great effect on your society because it meant that you were unprepared for a future war with Russia or invasion by Russia. So, to summarize that, my main point is that the counterinsurgency doctrine of the United States had a very damaging impact, I think, on the Baltic states. And it's very important that we moved away from that. And so now, as we begin this new surge and new change in thinking, much of this is going to affect our military doctrine. Now, there was a case in point where we forgot about the lessons of a war, and that was the Russian invasion of Georgia in August of 2008. We had, the NATO and the United States had a great opportunity to learn lessons from that war against Russia's invasion of Georgia, but we failed to learn those lessons. And if we would have studied the lessons, we would have known some of the important details of what happened in Ukraine today. And in eastern Ukraine and Crimea, because many of the tactics used by the Russians in Georgia were later also used, and with even greater sophistication, in Donbass. Now, how does all this, with hybrid warfare, how does it affect Lithuania? Well, when you look at the map, and you consider the idea of hybrid threat to Lithuania, there are many military dimensions to consider for a conventional threat from different sides. But the nature and axes of these military threats have evolved. It is not only the threat of a conventional invasion by Russian armored forces across the place we call the Suwalki Gap, the border between Lithuania and Poland. That is what we commonly refer to today, and what General Hodges has been describing as the Suwalki Gap. But there are other threats to Lithuania and the Baltic states that also appear and are very much a threat that are represented by hybrid warfare. And then hybrid warfare is not just about a conventional attack or it's an attack by Little Green, but it's also psychological operations. A case in point was during the Wales NATO summit, showed the psychological element of the kidnapping of what Messner calls terrorism, but it was the kidnapping of an Estonian military officer on the territory of a NATO ally, and his name was Ester Culver. And Ester Culver's kidnapping came in Estonia 2 days after President Obama had visited Tallinn and told the Estonians that we're with you, we support you. 2 days later, Ester Culver was kidnapped in a military act on Estonian territory that was a major incident and a very powerful psychological blow to Estonia. It was powerful because it was a brazen act of state terrorism by Russia that obviously failed to invoke Article 5. In fact, the very nature of hybrid warfare, in my opinion, is to confuse the idea about what is a flagrant act and violation, act of war, and this confused reality over whether the emergence of little green men is actually an invasion or not. The problem for Lithuania and for the Baltic states is if Germany or France question a terrorist act and fail to invoke Article 5, then Putin will win. He will win the first round of the Baltic. And it's a very dangerous situation because the kidnapping of Culver, in my opinion, was the first round. That is why Esther Culver is what we call the first hybrid prisoner of war. And throughout the history of Cold War, I would tell you that there was never an incident of a NATO officer being kidnapped on NATO territory. That never happened. There were hundreds of American officers running around East Germany in the Potsdam mission, and never were these officers kidnapped and held hostage by the Soviets. So this is a very new and unique dimension. Now, one does not have to realize that you don't have to look too far in Lithuania to know that Lithuania has its own Donbass, or Crimea, next door, in this region we call Kaliningrad. This is what I call hybrid warfare's backdoor to Lithuania. Kaliningrad could become a major hybrid threat because of its proximity to Klaipėda, Lithuania's only deep-water port. The Klaipėda and the Nida Peninsula, also called the Neringa Split, which is that piece of sand adjoining Klaipėda, could permit Russian special forces the ability to enter the port city, seize several buildings, declare themselves in control of the area, and demoralize Lithuania before NATO or the Lithuanian government could understand what was happening. So for this reason, Kaliningrad is to the Baltic what Crimea is to the Black Sea. Kaliningrad is a major platform for Russian power projection into the Baltic, and containing this threat is a major strategic challenge to Lithuania and the NATO planners. Now, the next point of all the different threats that are emerging is your neighbor next door called Belarus. I was in Belarus last weekend. I met with many of the Belarusian officials there, and I have to tell you that Belarus occupies an increasingly strategic position for NATO, and it also is a strategic position for the Baltic state. Belarus is a major topic, and becoming more so these days because of its proximity. The major security threat and problem for the Baltic states and for Lithuania is the strategic issue of time and space. President Putin in September announced that Moscow was preparing to open an air base in Belarus. This decision was rejected by President Lukashenko, and in this announcement, which was not true, should be a wake-up call to the West and to the Baltic states about Belarus. Belarus should become an area that is a demilitarized, non-aligned, neutral country. In other words, if there are no Russian ground troops in Belarus, it gives the Baltic states time and it gives you security. Yes, Belarus is close to Russia. Yes, they are a partner in Zapad 2013 military exercises. But there is still no Russian ground troops in Belarus. The minute there are Russian ground troops in Belarus, it changes the scenario for the Baltics and for Lithuania's security. So my recommendation is avoid Belarus becoming a Czechoslovakia of 1968. We need to make sure that there is no Russian air base in Belarus. We need to make sure that Belarus is neutral and non-aligned. And in Belarus is very critical for several reasons from the Baltic air policing that is going on. If a Russian air base is established in Belarus, the reaction time for NATO aircraft in Lithuania and the Baltic states goes from 20 minutes down to 7 minutes. So 7 minutes, as you know, as people who are interested in military affairs, is a very short time. You have to be prepared. You have to have time to react. That's why time and space matter. They matter to the security of Lithuania. So anytime you look at a map, and many policymakers in the West don't look at maps, you need to figure out that this area of Belarus is very strategically important. As my good friend Paul Goebel likes to say, the shortest route from Moscow to Berlin is through Belarus. So you may not like President Lukashenko, but he can become, in my opinion, he can become our Tito. He can make Belarus a neutral and non-aligned free nation free of Russian ground troops in the same way that Tito blocked Soviet expansion into the Balkans, misspoke there. But so whether you like Lukashenko or not, he could become a barrier and should become a barrier to Russian expansion into the Baltic. Now, All of you here today are interested in the lessons and what happened in the Donbass. I think, in my opinion, and when you look back on the Donbass, you need to be aware that there are 4 strategic lessons that apply to Lithuania where you can learn from the Russia's war in Donbass. The 4 points that I would like to emphasize that are very key and very strategic, important to learn are 1, electronic warfare, 2, command and control, number 3, use of special forces, and number 4, information operations and the role of countering Russian propaganda. Now, electronic warfare. This was one of the key tactics used by the Russian military in eastern Ukraine that was very predominant and used in August 2008 during Russia's invasion of Georgia. Electronic jamming equipment blocked cell phones, it blocked communications, and it spread panic among the troops when they could not communicate with one another. In some cases, this inspired fear in Georgian forces who felt hopeless and they were cut off from the Georgian high command. The sophisticated use of electronic jamming was used again by the Russians in eastern Ukraine in 2015. And as commanding general of the U.S. Army Forces in Europe, General Ben Hodges recently noted when the U.S. stopped investing in powerful electronic jammers after 9/11, the Russians kept investing and upgrading their jamming technology and equipment, and they now have a major advantage in this key area of the technology on the hybrid battlefield. My second point, command and control. In 20 years of independence of Ukraine, they never held a military exercise larger than 1,000 men. Ukraine's greatest military challenge in the East was its inability to organize and deploy and maneuver its armed forces because of its inexperience in command and control. By this, I mean the movement and deployment of troops on the battlefield. Ukraine's high command is dominated, unfortunately, by many Soviet-era officers who have no experience in managing tens of thousands of men. Earlier this year, in Debaltseve, in February 2015, Ukrainian forces were deployed in an indefensible valley that was attacked from all sides by Russian forces. And Ukraine most preciously lost the most important thing that it was given to it by the United States. It lost its anti-mortar radars that were recently arrived in the United States. They were destroyed in Debaltseve. Ukraine in this instance narrowly avoided a repetition of what I would call another Dien Bien Phu because of the poor decision-making by the political and military leadership of Ukraine. This should be a lesson for many of them. Ukraine narrowly avoided another Ilovaisk, and this type of decision-making and command and control in Ukraine is very much a challenge, but there is hope. There's hope because there are forces like the Azov Battalion, where many Georgian military officers are serving. Georgian military officers who are serving in Ukraine and Mariupol have command and control experience. They have training in NATO headquarters, and this experience is helping the Ukrainians. It's helping them learn because Ukraine has spent the last 20 years doing nothing with its military, while places like Lithuania and Georgia have invested the resources and sent officers to NATO, and you have this experience. But command and control, again, is a very critical area. The third point, use of special forces. The Russians have used extensive special forces in eastern Ukraine, and this has been a key concern as we looked at the situation in terms of the Ukrainian armed forces. Very poorly modeled, they're very poorly organized, and Ukraine is now trying rapidly to develop its special forces. So in hybrid warfare, the special forces will play an extremely important role, and in my opinion, they will play an even more important role than the regular ground forces. That's why we want to avoid little green men coming from Kaliningrad into Klaipėda, seizing parts of the Nida Peninsula, or even the Russian trains that transit Lithuania. As many of you know, the Russian trains cross Lithuania on their way to Kaliningrad, and these are a danger, and it's a hybrid threat within these trains. But with the Lithuanian increase, if Lithuania increases its defense budget, you will have more resources to deal with the hybrid threat. So the best deployment, the best plan for the Baltic states, again, in my opinion, is the need, what we had during the Cold War, we called the Berlin Brigade. I think the United States needs to invest and try to help the Baltic states create their own multinational forces and have multinational NATO forces on the territory of the Baltic states, either in Lithuania or Latvia or Estonia. But these special forces could be from, or these special type of units could be from the United States, France, United Kingdom, Germany, and even Norway and Denmark could contribute small numbers because the Berlin Brigade in the Cold War was not a very large group. but it was symbolically very strategically important. And that's what it's all about these days, is having symbolic strategic importance. So a similar type of Berlin Brigade for the Baltic states, I think, perhaps not under the current U.S. administration, but definitely if there's a change in the United States in the White House, this type of idea could be developed further. So that brings me to my last and fourth point, is the idea of information operations and the role of countering Russian propaganda. As we've learned from the case of Eastern Ukraine, countering Russian propaganda is extremely, extremely important. And this is the one lesson that we can learn from the information battlefield. Lithuania cannot rely on its membership in NATO and take it for granted that the United States remain an important ally. I say this because many people in the United States do not quite understand the strategic importance of the Baltic states. When I talk about the information battlefield, you have to realize that many Americans don't understand this. And you cannot, even though there's a large Lithuanian diaspora in the United States, you have to realize that not all the American public see a strategic interest in the Baltic states. That is why it's very important that you educate the American public and American universities and colleges. They need to have more information about the Baltic states and their security. The Jamestown Foundation did an assessment last summer of many of the major libraries and the Library of Congress. And there are only 5 books in the Library of Congress that deal with Baltic defense and security that were published since 2005. So if you want Americans to learn about how to defend the Baltic, you're going to have to give them something to read because they won't understand it. And I can tell you now that the information component is very critical and very important. And the other part to it is that Lithuania occupies a very important place on the information battlefield. To me, nothing is more convincing than the construction here in downtown Vilnius of the Moscow Cultural Center, which to me is an information dagger pointed at the very heart of Lithuanian identity. It's pointed at Lithuanian society. The Moscow Cultural Center is being built, and that will become a major flow of information to the Lithuanian society, and I'm very worried about it. And I don't understand why the Moscow Cultural Center is being built, because it will ultimately undermine this Lithuanian society. And so Lithuania cannot win the information battle by letting Russia exploit Lithuanian democracy to create a fifth column here in Vilnius. Now, elsewhere on the information fronts, many of you many of my Lithuanian friends were commenting and sending me emails about an article that appeared on November 12th in the Washington Post newspaper. The title of the article was 6 Reasons Not to Worry About Russia Invading the Baltics. Now, this was a very disturbing article. What is most disturbing about it? Well, the fact that America is writing about it and it's in the Washington Post, that's disturbing. But the other part is that the person who wrote this article is a professor at the United States Military Academy. So you have a professor at the U.S. Military Academy talking about why the Baltic states are not important and why there is no Russian threat. That should be to you, to my friends in Lithuania, that should be a wake-up call to you that the United States, that there's a problem and an information gap, as I mentioned to you, in getting here and in the United States. You need to bring more Americans to Lithuania to understand your security interests. You need to bridge the gap, narrow this gap, so that this distance between an understanding of why the Baltic states are important, you have to do this, because this article in the Washington Post was a tragedy, but it also should be used as a way forward for you. There's also a problem here in information that the United States, as I said, has a lack of information about the Baltic states. We at the Jamestown Foundation, if we want to learn something about Baltic defense and security, we have to pay $3,000 to Baltic News Service to get a subscription to a publication that tells us about Baltic defense and security. My friends, I don't think the United States, we should be paying money to learn about your security. You need to be giving us information for free. And this is a tragedy. Now, with your increase in defense spending, you're increasing your defense spending. So a good portion of your defense spending should go on information and public outreach so that every American college and university has some type of information about Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia. You need to secure the information front. So Jamestown Foundation, which I head, is very committed to educating the American public about the Baltics. Last year, we had the first ever conference in Washington called Baltic Defense and Security. This was the first time in Washington, D.C. that ever organized a conference on the Baltic defense and security. We had many of the colleagues come from the Baltic states to participate and speak in this. So I think this is in fact, I think this is one of the most critical areas as we look forward for Lithuania. And as you, my distinguished riflemen, as you're sitting here in the audience and you're thinking about your military planning, you need to keep working on the information front and keep thinking ahead about the hybrid threats that you face. This is why, my friends, some people were asking, well, why are the Lithuanian riflemen associated? Why is it important to have riflemen? Well, in my opinion, and I'll use my little bit of Lithuanian to determine the phrase strateginis gilas, which means in English strategic depth. The Lithuanian riflemen are Lithuania's strategic depth because the two greatest enemies you have are time and space. The time is a critical factor because the fastest time that American forces and NATO can get to the Baltics if there's a crisis is 72 hours. The NATO Spearhead Division that's being created in Europe will take over a week to 2 weeks to get to the Baltic states. That is a long and very critical time. You have 700 kilometers of border to defend, but your army is only 10,000 men. So in the recent series of Russian military exercises called Zapad 2015, they had as many as 75,000 men participate in those exercises. For me, this means that after the Lithuanian army, the Lithuanian riflemen are the next line of defense. But there are a lot of you, and Lithuania certainly does not lack in patriotism. But what you do lack is what the Russians call Yedina Nachalna, or unity of command. And here is your greatest weakness. You need to follow in the footsteps of your brothers in Estonia and merge to create something like what Estonia has, which is called the National Defense League, so that groups like the Lithuanian Rifles Association can be put under the command of the Lithuanian ground forces in case that there is a war or conflict, because you need your unity of command. You need organization. And as I mentioned in Donbass and eastern Ukraine, command and control was a major problem there. And Lithuania has taken a great step by reintroducing conscription. This will help you answer the part of the problem of time of distance, and it boosts your manpower. But the next challenge for Lithuania is to create the unity of command and continue to follow the footsteps of countries like Estonia, who never lost sight of the challenges that they face from the east. Thank you very much, and I'm eager to answer any questions you have.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you very much, Mr. Howard. Now we have some time for questions. I'll give you some time to gather your mind and maybe prepare some questions. We'll have some my fellow sisters, riflemen, to assist you with microphones. But I have my few questions of my own, Mr. Howard. First of all, about Belarus. You said that it's very important for Belarus to keep it neutral. How do you think it's possible when we see how volatile is Mr. Lukashenko, how he is basically one of the most opportunistic country leaders, and he's playing a very sophisticated game just for his own gain? How can we trust such neighbor?
Well, he said, first of all, that Putin announced that there would be an air base, and Belarus didn't know anything about this air base. And then Lukashenko came out and said that there would be no new air base. And not only that, he said he wanted, if there were ever an air base, that he would have Belarusian pilots flying the planes. So this is a key thing, that Belarus may be a partner of Russia, but Russian ground troops, let me say this, Vilnius is 37 kilometers from your border. You have just increased your defense budget 2% of your GDP. If there is one Russian armored division on the border with Belarus, on 37 kilometers from your border, you will have to double your defense spending because you have no tanks in your army, you have no armored, maybe one armored regiment, but this will completely overnight change Lithuania's defense perspectives, because suddenly you will have to have tanks and you'll have to, to deal with this threat. But there are no tanks on your border now. Belarus has to move to become like Yugoslavia. It has to become a barrier to Russian expansion. And there are no Russian ground troops in Belarus now. That's why time and space they may cooperate with Russia, but the important thing is that they don't keep continuous ground troops there. And they are moving, and also Lukashenko signed the Donbass Accords and has traveled to Ukraine and supported Ukraine's territorial integrity. So he can become a Tito.
You also talked about informational situation and the need to provide the American public with information about Baltic security. And I think this is very important, especially for this audience when we have members of parliament and our high-standing officials listening to these words. But how could it be done, and which parts of the American public should be targeted? Whether it would be the media, or as you mentioned, the educated public colleges, or maybe we should try to reach that, if I may say so, average Joe in Idaho or Montana or Wyoming, which maybe even doesn't know what the Baltics are. So what should be the plan of Lithuania and or maybe the whole three Baltic nations?
Well, first of all, you have an embassy in Washington, and it'd be no problem for them to create a newsletter and get this information and distribute it and put it on their website. That's the first. Then you have the news agency Delphi, and I do not have stock in Delphi, okay? I don't have any friends there, so I don't have any economic investment in Delphi. But Delphi, I think, would be a very good, if they had a defense newsletter of information about your security, distribute it and put it on their website, I think it would be very beneficial. So the problem here is information and getting access to it, and the only source you have is Baltic News Service, and they charge me $3,000 a year. So, I think that there's enough of a diaspora in the United States of Lithuanian Americans to create their own newsletter and get it into the hands of congressmen, policymakers, people in the Pentagon, and it doesn't have to be very detailed information because there's nothing exists. And so it's very hard to get this type of information. And in fact, all three Baltic countries should create their own Baltic Defense News Agency and give it out for free, because how are we going to learn about these threats? I mean, Lithuania does a very good job of bringing people here and meeting people and understanding it. But people like Glen Howard are not enough. You need American graduate students, people studying PhDs at colleges and universities. You have to bring them here, educate them. They need books and publications to read about your security. Sometimes you can go on the internet and you have to pay $100 just to buy a book about Lithuania. It's crazy, and this stuff should be free and available to the public. And Jamestown, by the way, is free and available to the public.
Well, I'm pretty sure that during our live broadcast here, the editor-in-chief of the Delphi is listening and watching the broadcast. So I think she can take these your suggestions into opinion. Okay, questions from the hall for Mr. Howard. Yes, please. Yes. Mr. Rajubalis, the member of Parliament of Lithuania.
Thank you, Mr. Howard. Thank you for your excellent analysis. But I still have some question regarding the Belarus. And of course, it's a great idea to see Lukashenko as a new Tito. But the facts speaks about themselves. I mean, Russia already has a military bases. Two. Yes.
But they're not bases. They're eavesdropping facilities.
Okay.
And electronic.
The second
That's
thing,
different than a ground base.
Yes, but just second thing. Yesterday, Lukashenko approved 5 years common plan, which includes common action, Russian and Belarusian military regarding the NATO plans, regarding the NATO military. It means that there works years and by years strengthening their military cooperation. And to see Lukashenko as an independent or quasi-even independent person, I think it's a little bit too optimistic. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rajubalis.
Well, first of all, Lukashenko said that Belarus would not be another region of Russia. That is sovereignty. That's state sovereignty. And again, there are no Russian ground troops there. They may cooperate with them, and there are no Russian armored divisions on your border with Lithuania. So again, demilitarized, non-aligned Belarus is interested. The best ally of NATO is a neutral, non-aligned Belarus. And it's your best ally because it gives you time and space.
Just to follow up, Mr. Howard, what do you think Belarus can expect or ask of Western world or NATO or EU for its role?
Economic assistance.
Okay.
That's all they need. That will keep the Russians out.
Okay. Prašau, klausimas čia.
Just a short comment on Belarus. I don't think that you are quite right talking about Belarus. The most thing that we could expect if we'll have the crisis that Belarus will stay neutral, but the territory will be 100% used by Russian militaries, and I don't think today that we can see any chance that Belarus could be a friendly state. So, well,
So he should have accepted the air base.
No, he definitely shouldn't have expected, but I think that he will do that. That's only the matter of time, and that's the matter of money. No, he said no, but there were a million times when he said different things and then he changed his opinion. But let's say that I'm wrong and in future you're right. Another thing I would like you to ask, you said about the defensibility of Lithuania. And you said that we don't have tanks, and what kind of things you think we should have to be able to stand up against aggression? What kind of military things, what kind of mechanical things, how you think we should be moving with our development of armed forces?
Get to 2%. Why weren't you at 2%? I mean, it's very evident. You got rid of conscription. Why did you get rid of conscription? Why did Estonia keep conscription? Was it economically expedient? I mean, was it beneficial to Belarus? I mean, to Lithuania not to have a conscription, but now you have it? I mean, the greatest thing you need is manpower. That is what the French call la vie en masse. That's the Napoleonic concept of the army swimming with the people. And that's what the riflemen are all about. But you got to go to the next stage. You have to have the riflemen integrated with the Ministry of Defense so that everybody knows what to do when they come. Because that itself is a deterrent. The riflemen are a deterrent against Russian aggression. And it's psychological, too. I mean, the Russians, they know you're all armed, they won't come.
Mr. Howard, you're very right about everything what you said. One question, to reiterate your advice. You were talking about the Berlin Brigade in your presentation.
The what?
Berlin Brigade.
Yeah.
The armed forces of NATO in Berlin enclave. So, what would be your advice? What should Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia do in order to get such a brigade to our countries?
Well,
practical steps. What would you advise?
The key term in English about the Berlin Brigade is the word tripwire. It was a tripwire for aggression. That's why in the Fulda Gap, which was the gap where the American armored and tank units were, you had multinational units you had multinational units facing the Russians. Now, obviously the Cold War is dead and over, but if you had a multinational unit, it doesn't have to be very many. The point.
What should we do to get them here?
Well, I think that depends on the United States and political leadership from the United States. I mean, you can invite your friends, the Danes, and you have Norwegians coming here for exercises, but the point is that you need, say in Klaipeda, you need a multinational unit that's symbolically important to NATO. Are important to the Russians sitting in Kaliningrad. They know that if they do something in Klaipeda, that they'll be facing the full force of NATO. And that's the problem here, is it's also psychological. And the United States is not giving you that leadership. But I'm confident that among the leaders coming up in the new leadership, say even Hillary Clinton will be even tougher on Putin than I think than the current administration. So, and I'm not a Republican, or I'm non-aligned. So.
Okay.
Yes, we have a question from the minister.
Well, okay. Let me just give Mr. Landsbergis a question, and then Mrs. Yuknevičian, and also sorry for the sound interference. Must be a Moscow Cultural Center testing the antennas.
Mr. Howard, indeed it was very interesting to listen to your presentation, and I'd say even sobering experience in some cases. My question is, the thing that I didn't hear is, you didn't mention it, at least not extensively, about the regional cooperation. How deep and how important do you think our cooperation between Lithuania, Baltic states, and the Scandinavian allies would be? Since we would be, in the case of aggression, we would be talking about the defense of the Baltic Sea as a lake. So Denmark, Sweden, Finland, how important are our cooperation? Should we deepen our cooperation with these countries besides with Denmark, besides with our cooperation in NATO?
Well, I think the Danes are very critically important, and recently I was writing to a U.S. Marine Corps general discussing the idea of putting a Marine Amphibious Division on Bornholm and what type of impact that would have on Russian planning in Kaliningrad. So there are things that the United States can do in the Baltic. As you know, it's a very shallow area. You can't have aircraft carriers in the Baltic, but I think that that the United States, and I think that the leadership of Sweden and even Norway and even Finland in participating in exercises is the greatest it's ever been. But again, your greatest challenge is the time and space issue. And that's why you've started pre-deploying, NATO started putting pre-positioning supplies here. But if you look at a map, if you look at the discussion about pre-positioning supplies, you will increasingly see greater Russian pressure on Belarus. And it will become so big that it will be harder, because the deeper NATO gets here in the Baltic, the more Russia will want to move. And this is why I'm sorry I talk about Belarus so important, but look at the map. It's an invasion corridor. I'll tell you something. There may be Ukrainians here today, but if there's an invasion through Belarus, the strategic role of Belarus is not only for the Baltic states, but it's also for Ukraine. It forces 65,000, 70,000 men in eastern Ukraine to have to be redeployed to defend the capital of Kiev. This is look at the map. It's all about geopolitics. And for the first time, since since the Baltic states have gained independence, we are now talking about the geopolitics of this region. It's no longer a backwater. It's not only an area where you got into NATO and we're not talking about it. We're talking about many different aspects. We're talking about Litgali. We're talking about Klaipėda. We're talking about many different areas, Narva. So the hybrid threat is very big, very vast, and it can be many different fronts. But the Baltic, as you say, is a very critical point. And the Russian firing of Excalibur missiles from the Caspian Sea using the Excalibur missiles on those Russian naval corvettes was a very strategically very important signal. And as you know, Russian naval aviation and Russian Navy can play a disruptive role, and they do play a disruptive role in the Baltic. Just look in the case of Lithuania trying to get the electrical cable between linked to Sweden. So, and this is a problem. The SNAP exercises are a problem. But again, time and space is very critical.
Mrs. Yuknevičiūtė, the former Minister
Yes.
of Defense.
Hello. Thank you very much. Nice to have you here. And thank you everything you are doing. To have in the United States at least platoon of the people like you would be big power, of course, to defend Euro-Baltic states and the United States. My question, unfortunately, was asked by Gabrielius Landsbergis, but I would like a little bit to give an intervention on Belarus. I agree with you. Despite I have maybe different opinions with even my colleagues in my party, but I agree with you. Strategic depth is very important for us, and I have to remind that in 2010, we signed with Belarus, at that time, a military agreement. The only NATO country which has symbolic, of course, but agreement among the ministers of defense is Lithuania and Belarus. And this understanding, I think, is very important for the future. And this is what I think we have to change a lot our mind. Of course, maybe it's idealistic understanding for the future. But without that, strategic depth to Scandinavian countries and Belarus, despite they are very different, it's utmost important for us. So thank you very much.
Thank you for your statement.
Take into account.
Thank you. Any more questions? Yes, please. Just wait for a microphone.
Thank you so much. Your very dramatic presentation paradoxically gives me a more optimistic view to the future. But I would add to all the questions posed by my colleagues a perspective of Lithuanian and Polish military cooperation, especially having this in mind, this moment of time and space, Lithuania and Poland, from the perspective of our regional defense. Thank you.
Thank you.
I agree. In fact, I'd like to say that there's more German tanks in the Polish army than there are in the German army.
Okay, I see this is becoming a question and answer session from the Lithuanian Conservative Party. So maybe brothers and sisters, riflemen, or our army, who wants to get a question? Yes, question please here, and then a question there.
NATO Energy Security Center of Excellence. I would like to ask your opinion about Nord Stream. What would you think, plans to expand Nord Stream? It's an issue in this time, and what could be the best reaction from our region?
The best ally now is low demand for gas in Europe. That will undermine Baltic Stream. But it looks like, unfortunately, the Germans are going through. There's nothing you can do. Let's just hope that the United States wakes up and starts helping Europe get Azerbaijani gas.
A question here, please.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Howard, for your presentation. And I have a question. Actually, I'm representing National Defense Foundation, Lithuania, and Colonials Association. And I have a question about your views, how we can utilize non-governmental level in dealing with those hybrid threats. So just your advice. Thank you.
Well, you know, the NGOs are very critically important, and as you know, in the case of the war in Ukraine, that the NGOs, even though there was a very weak government, they really played a very important role in the information sphere. In fact, they saved Ukraine, I think. And Ukrainians, NGOs were actually putting their money together, and they actually spent $100,000 to buy a helicopter to rescue troops wounded from the battlefield. So, you know, Ukrainian NGOs are very critical, very important, and NGOs in general, you know, I think in the information area are the best way to defeat Russian trolls using the internet, posting things on your websites. I think that in the information battlefield that you're very critical. And I think that, you know, they can play an important role in educating people, especially in the United States, about the importance of the Baltic states. And I think that's a very good point you raise.
Thank you, Mr. Mažeikis, and then the gentleman at the
Gintautas Mažeikis, I would like to ask you about soft power. You know that ordinary people's different analytics considered soft power of Russia or Russian strategy on the level of soft power as some level of threat. But do you see possibility from Baltic countries to use the same instrument for the defense purposes? I mean, do you see the possibility for paramilitaries and militaries and governments to develop defense soft power? I mean, not the tanks, but you need on.
No, I totally agree. I soft powers. I mean, when I'm talking about information, that's very critical. I mean, that's what I mean. I mean, soft power is through your NGOs, through the operating on television networks. I really don't have. You know, you're issuing some reports, and some reports in the West have been written about Russian soft power. But also, you need to talk about what they're doing inside of Lithuania. I mean, you know, it's right here next door with your cultural center. I mean, you know, we need to be talking about that. So there's a lot of things for you to focus on. Soft power is one of them. And the Russians invested a lot of money in that. So as you'll hear today from Ms. Wold, who's sitting here, who is an information warrior.
Mr. Howard, maybe a follow-up on the Moscow Cultural Center. How do you think it happened that the Moscow Cultural Center
I don't know,
got
you tell
involved?
me.
But from
there's a lot of it must be revolving around money somewhere. Somebody, I wonder who owned the land.
Okay. What about a city, municipality of a city? Should it?
I don't know. I that's all I'm going to say. No, I don't want to get into Lithuanian politics.
Okay.
So.
Okay. A question here, please.
Mr. Howard, you were mentioning strategic depth in all your presentations. And you mentioned that, and I'm Robert Jotka from the Lithuanian Rifleman Union. I'm a lawyer, business lawyer by profession, and I'm also representative of the working group of the Rifleman Association in preparation of certain amendments of laws in connection to carrying of arms by the Rifleman Association. And to come back to your presentation, you mentioned strategic depth. And you mentioned that the Rifleman Association of Lithuania would be a crucial element in the defense of the country, providing the depth. At the moment, the US has a very, very deep tradition of having arms at home by active civil populace. It's entrenched in your Second Amendment of the Constitution, if I'm not mistaken. And what would be your opinion In Estonia, for example, the members of Kaitseliit or the home defense are entitled and almost even obliged to have a full battle complex, full battle gear, at least 400 rounds, full automatic equipment at home in order to be able to respond in the shortest possible time. We in Lithuania are trying to achieve the same goal, essentially, for our Riflemen Association and for the CASP or volunteer units of the Lithuanian Army. So what would be your opinion? Is it a positive development or?
Well, in terms of time and space, yes. I mean, that seems to be we in America had our Minutemen, and they were always ready to rush to defense, and that's why we have the National Guard. But, in the United States, you can be a member of the National Guard and not necessarily have weapons at home, but they do have weapons depots where the National Guard is based. And I'm not the best expert to talk about this, but our distinguished Estonian colleague here will talk about it, and I think he can give you a better answer on it. But I think that the United States gave, because we believe strongly in a professional army, and it worked for the United States, and we always advised the countries of the former Soviet Union to try to develop a professional army. And I always think this was a very bad example and bad advice, just like we were advising them to develop their militaries for counterinsurgency strategies. So I think that this is, I think that the ability for the militaries to be able to come and for the National Guard is a great concept, and it's the answer to the problem, because your problem is in dealing with the threat from the east is numbers and quantity, and they won't come if they know that every person is armed, and that'll certainly be. And the key word here is deterrence, and we've stopped using that word in the West. In fact, they refuse to use the word deterrence. But I think that this type of idea and concept, which actually began with Pilsudski and the Poles and the Miracle in the Vistula in 1920, this came from the Polish riflemen. They had that tradition. So this is, I think it's a great tradition, and it is a European one. And I think it's something, maybe it's better suited for this part of the world than say, maybe it's not the Central Asia model, but it certainly is for the Baltic states, and it fits you perfectly.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have to stick on the schedule, so 3 last questions. First of all, Mr. Sekmokas, former Minister of Energy.
Thank you very much for your presentation. A little bit different question. Probably you know that in Astravas, Belarus is going with ongoing construction of nuclear power plant. It's a definitely geopolitical project. It doesn't have military threat, but of course it has very different, a real threat to Lithuania. How do you find it within the concept of hybrid war?
Thank you.
First of all, the nuclear power plant originally was going to be built by the United States in 2010. They had an agreement with Westinghouse. And then the events in Belarus changed the political situation, and Lukashenko decided to invite in the Russians to do it. And they're building 2 nuclear power plants, if my memory is correct. And so I think that is a problem. But I'll give you a bigger problem. And I'm sorry to talk so much about Belarus, but Belarus has 175 kilograms of highly enriched nuclear weapons grade uranium. And the United States has been wanting Belarus to give that back to Russia. Now let me ask you a question. What happens to this highly enriched weapons-grade uranium to Russia's military nuclear program for warheads? Is it in our interest for Belarus to give this back to Russia? And the policy question is, I think, no. So then the question becomes, who do they give it to? And what do they do with it? So there's a lot of issues regarding nuclear power plants, but there's other issues out here that are very critical and very important, because the Russians are modernizing their nuclear weapons. They view nuclear weapons as a deterrent, a very valuable tool to use in warfare, because Russia is becoming smaller as a country. They're demographically losing their population, and so Russians will grow more and more dependent on the use of nuclear weapons. And it's up to us in the West to try to learn how to use, to understand Russian nuclear weapons doctrine and to try to counter it. But it's an issue that's coming back, and I don't have the answer to your question about that, but That's why I keep saying, you need a neutral space between you and the Russians.
Okay, 2 final questions, please, lady here.
Sir, thank you very much for your presentation. It was really very interesting. My name is Gintare, and one of the really interesting points you made was that, sometimes we are living in a bubble and think that, United States truly know many things about Lithuania, about the Baltic region. However, the reality is different, and you offered several points that maybe we should educate the American society and so on and so forth. But my point is that how do you bring the natural interest and curiosity in our region? Because one thing is when you come and you educate them in the universities, in the think tanks, etc., but how do you bring the wider society's interest in our region? Because as we say, what is far from you, it's kind of none of my business. Do you have any ideas? Thank you.
You have to offer scholarships and information available. You have to create opportunities for some person getting a PhD somewhere who has an interest in studying in Baltic security. You have to make it possible for this person to come here and get a scholarship. You have to educate them, and that, if you're not doing anything, then why would they be? I mean, you look at all the scholarships to go to Russia. I mean, it's lots and lots of scholarships in our foundations, but there's very little on defense and security for the Baltics, and little in defense and security in general. So you have to provide information. You have to get books translated into English and make them available at a very low cost. And I'm saying that there's many books on the internet that you have to pay up close to $75, $80, even $100 just to buy some book about the Baltic states and Roosevelt, and this is so the historical level of understanding is very low in the United States. Yes, the Lithuanian diaspora, they know your history, but other Americans don't, and they don't understand why this area of the world is important, and you're going to have to make that case, because I can tell you one thing: in the information sphere, the Russians are already doing this, but they, the minute that there's a crisis in the United States and the Baltic states, you will see the Russians jump into action, and you will be completely unprepared. I mean, there's a reason why Sputnik operates and publishes in the languages, in Polish and Macedonian. They put all these languages, and so you as a country, you have to devote the information resources and figure out a strategy about what it is you want to do. For example, I know of no book in existence that has been printed in the last couple of years that just talks about what is Lithuania's defense and security interests. Now, I know that in Estonia they have a think tank called that publishes books, but they're there, and Estonian people have them, but they're not distributed in the United States. You can't even get them. So they need to be thinking through, they need to figure out how to get this stuff in American libraries and go to the top 10 American libraries in the United States that have security studies, like say Georgetown, or American University, or GW University, and make sure that these places have a nice stockpile of books about Baltic security and independence, and go through and develop a committee here in Lithuania and say, these are the top 10 books that we want American universities and colleges to read so they can be educated. Then you figure out what the book literature is. Then you decide which universities get it. Then you contact those universities. Then you start trying to go to the different academic seminars and make sure that people get this information. And that's the beginning of a strategy. And basically, by what you're saying, sitting down and thinking about it, that's where you sit down. That's the first step. So that is my comment.
Okay, the final question, please, here.
Good morning, Neringa Weisbode from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Thank you for the energy and also for giving us this very healthy kick on getting our story out to the world. My question is related to your evaluation on the success and effectiveness of the Russian narrative and the Russian soft power in the US, because I somehow truly think and believe that there is also Russian house in US, or even few of them in your country as well. So could you elaborate on that, and how also we can make the societies in the Western countries more resilient to that as well?
Well, I'd like to say that 2 years ago in Washington, we did a search of websites of different think tanks, and there was barely just maybe we didn't find but 1 or 2 reports on the Baltic states. Now, since Crimea and the annexation and the problems, you've now got 2 think tanks in Washington actively kind of now starting to do stuff on it. Now 3 if you include Jamestown. So there's starting to be some activism and some cooperation, but I think that in the information sphere in the United States, the Russians have such an advantage, but again, it's not just your problem, it's our problem. And when I'll tell you, when President Reagan came into office, the first directive that he had was a national security directive, I think it was called NSD 77, that was on information. And it started developing an information policy, and I think that's what Lithuania needs. In fact, you should go back and study what Reagan did and when he came to presidency in 1980, and what he did, I think would be very helpful, because you have to develop your strategy and outreach to the United States and to Europe. And I think that you have to figure out what is the different information angles that you need. Now, your question was about Russia, and there's a lot of elements too. For example, there are academic funding institutions in the United States that fund academics to come to study in Russia and in the former Soviet Union. Someone in the Lithuanian government should be looking at the lists of people, what they're studying, and where the fellowships are going, and make sure that there's a balance. In other words, if 90% of all the people getting grants are going to Yaroslavl or going to Novodievichy to get to grant to study Russian, history of Orthodoxy, you need to make sure that they are getting that there's a proper balance in some of the educational opportunities for people coming to the Baltic states, and also for security studies, and maybe even it'd be a good idea to create a Baltic security studies. So either a foundation or something that actually works in this area, and that their sole purpose is for this type of outreach. In fact, I think that would be, we can close down the Moscow Cultural Center and then call it the Baltic Security Foundation. And that's a good idea.
Okay, thank you very much. With this final idea, I think we can finalize. Thank you very much, Mr. Howard. Please, our audience, applause.